Welcome to The Breakdown with Brodkorb and Becky, a weekly podcast that breaks down politics, policy, and current affairs. I'm Becky Scherr.
And I'm Michael Brodkorb.
We are kicking things off this week by breaking down the Super Bowl weekend, the halftime controversy of sorts, our thoughts on the commercials, and what snacks we indulged in. Next, we are excited to get back with our first guest interview of 2026. It also happens to be our only guest, not counting panelists, who is returning for their third interview. That is none other than Dr. Scott Jensen. We previously interviewed Scott Jensen on the show back in the summer of 2023 when we broke down his 2022 gubernatorial campaign. And today we are returning our attention to his role in the 2026 election, hitting on the recent shift from running for governor to running for state auditor, how he is shifting his messaging and expertise to fit the role and break through the noise, and why he thinks state auditor is Republicans' best shot to win statewide in 2026. After our interview, we will break down the recent Star Tribune poll on ICE, immigration, Trump, and more. And we will end with rapid fire on a few updates and previews of some hot topics we will break down further later. Thank you for joining us and enjoy the show. So it was a big weekend of the Super Bowl. Did you watch? Did you enjoy? Did you have somebody that you were rooting for?
I watched. I'm a football fan. I watched. I was tossing and turning. I thought it was a fine game. It wasn't that exciting. Congratulations to Sam Darnold, who the Minnesota Vikings had last year, for winning that Super Bowl. And I've spoken to a number of Vikings fans, including Dan Minnesota, who was a guest of our podcast, and let him know that having Sam Darnold on our roster last year, not having him this year, and then seeing Sam Darnold win the Super Bowl, it's going to be a tough offseason for me and a number of Vikings fans. And then getting an update that our season tickets prices have gone up almost 10%, as we were noted in this last week. So it was a fun game. It was an interesting game to watch. Congratulations to Sam Darnold. Shout out to our favorite Patriots fan, Brian Strauser. Sorry it didn't work out this year. You have so many championships. There's nothing. I know it's tough to lose, but you guys have so many championships. It's just in excess of them. Watched it with family. Had some good food, some snacks. How about you?
Yeah, we just watched it at home, and by watched, I say that very loosely. It is during bedtime. Our almost 10-month-old is very loud and crawling and into everything, and a 3.5-year-old doesn't really work towards both parents sitting and enjoying the game. So I let, Joe is a little bit more, my husband, a little bit more of a football fan than I am. So we let him, be able to have his eyes on the screen a little bit more than I think I did. But I managed to watch a little bit, especially tune in during the commercials, watch the halftime show, and
Which one?
Well, we'll get to that. Before, okay. I want to focus on commercials. And of course, we had great snacks. So that is where I shine. That's my jam.
Bravo to you.
Thank you. All right. Curious of any of your standout commercials.
I liked the Dunkin' Donuts one, the 90s, with Ben Affleck and a lot of the Ted Danson, George Costanza, all those characters, the Dunkin' Donuts one. I like that. How about you?
I think that was great. I really liked a couple of the ones that I liked. The Coca-Cola Bears, being Pepsi fans, and the little spoof they did on Coldplay with them holding Pepsis in their hands, kind of in that Coldplay embrace, after that scandal. I thought that was great. There was a Guy Fieri one where he was had a, normal hair and buttoned up and talking about, when he uses his Bosch appliances, he's just a guy. I thought that was really funny. There was William Shatner did a Raisin Bran one, and they were talking good about fiber and Will Shat, he called himself, which, that guy is just in everything always so great. And then Jeff Goldblum, he can do no wrong in my mind. And a Jurassic Park spinoff was hilarious for Xfinity. Laura Dern was there. Awesome.
That was better than some of the recent. Someone noted on social media that was better than some of the recent movies.
So
Sam Neill. It was a great commercial.
So good. So yeah, commercials always great. I didn't cry at any. I think last year there was one that I got a little emotional about.
I'll check the tape. I think there was.
Yeah, I was also very pregnant at the time, so I'm going to blame that. But the halftime show. So I watched the NFL Bad Bunny Super Bowl halftime show. Which one did you watch?
I watched the halftime Bad Bunny one.
Great. Now, for anybody who might be living under a rock and not know, Turning Point USA organized what they called counter programming, as they titled it as an all-American halftime show. They featured rock and country artists, and they aimed it at viewers unhappy with Bad Bunny's performance. Your take? Did you think that, I mean, just on it in general, was it just an alternative? Are there racial undertones to it? Do you have any grand thoughts, or just want to relay what others were saying on it?
I think the controversy over the Super Bowl halftime show by any conservatives is one of the dumbest things that I've heard in recent memory. I cannot be angry all the time. And the level of outrage and animosity that I've seen towards people online about trying to stick it to someone for a halftime show. If there's anything that I'm not an expert on, it's not on music, pop culture, fashion, or anything fancy. I thought it was a great halftime show. I got to just tell you, I don't watch the NFL. I don't watch the Super Bowl for the halftime show. And so, but and I was talking with my family about this, and I was talking to my wife, and I said, hey, when I was even at my most partisan time, did I ever like what I would have raised to stink about something like this? And she said, no, like I've never been someone to be like, I'm only going to get my entertainment from conservatives or things like that. I thought it was ridiculous. I also can't get angry about it. I thought Bad Bunny did a great job. I have no authority, no expertise to judge a halftime show. Thought it was great, sounded fine, interesting, just the entire show. It's elaborate how they did that. I don't think anything really tops Prince in Miami. And I never once have ever thought like we need to have a very specific message at a halftime show. I never have thought that. We've had people, and I don't understand the controversy. I can't be angry all the time. And to those who wanted to be angry on Super Bowl Sunday about a halftime show, go find something else to be angry about. But I can't be angry and just rage about stuff that's so goddamn meaningless.
I agree. I mean, obviously, it really blew up to this whole thing, but I'm with you. It's like I don't necessarily listen to Bad Bunny's music. I Kendrick Lamar was also one that's not really my type of music. I mean, give me a NSYNC, Britney Spears, Aerosmith, one from back in the day, or loved Katy Perry. I mean, I am a little pop gal that likes that kind of thing. But I think that the NFL does what they do and they bounce around in different genres and different folks. And, they've obviously made an effort here. This is, from some of the stuff I've done for show prep, that they have been working to expand their outreach in Latino audiences over the years. 1 in 5 Americans is Hispanic and Latino. Obviously, they know that there is an audience, not only just among Hispanic and Latino, but Bad Bunny is one of the biggest artists in the country. Was recently on SNL, hilarious in some of those skits as well. And so I'm with you. Turn it off. Go take a potty break and grab a snack. Do whatever you need to do. It doesn't have to be this massive, wild thing. Of course, there are going to be, some folks are talking about how it's going to turn into this big cultural moment that we come back to, which may be it. But I want to just give a little attention to the show itself and some of the moments that I liked. It ended, there was the only thing more powerful than hate is love, which is
How can you be against
anybody,
that?
if you're against that, if that makes you angry, then like you need to look into yourself if you feel that that is offending you in some ways. The wedding that scene was there. Did you know that was a real wedding?
Yep.
This is a couple that asked him to come to their wedding, and he flipped the script, invited them there. So was the witness on their marriage certificate, was awesome. He had friends and family that he brought out. There were real people in those grass on the side, which I'm sure everybody has seen right now. Some great celebrities were there. Lady Gaga, Ricky Martin, which, oh my God, Ricky Martin looks incredible for being mid 50s. We had Pedro Pascal, Jessica Alba, Cardi B, Alex Earl, a lot of other celebrities there. It was just fun. It was upbeat. The visuals were great. I enjoyed it. I bopped along to it, and yeah, it was fun.
That's great.
That's what I know.
Would you would have thought, I mean, I will just be honest. I would have thought you were kind of weird, and I hope you would have thought I was kind of weird if I would have came to you and said, "We have to talk about how the turning point or the how outrageous it was what Bad Bunny did." I can't get angry all the time. I just can't. And I thought it was great. And
I'm a
I
big firm believer of scroll past if you don't like something, walk past without saying something. It's okay to be upset and just move on with your life. Like,
yes, you have
yep,
choices. You
we
don't have
do.
to watch everything. The
Yep.
one thing I will talk about, the one thing that did upset me about did upset me about Super Bowl weekend was I watched the Puppy Bowl,
Mhm.
and there was a dog that won the Puppy Bowl that later came out had passed away since the Puppy Bowl happened. It
What?
was this adorable little dog who was in kind of like a little wheelchair, and he passed away since the Puppy Bowl. And so
Oh,
that was kind
so
of tough.
sad.
But overall, great weekend. I really hope the Vikings are there sometime. And just a quick disclaimer again, if you're listening to the breakdown with Brodkorb and Becky, for any fashion, entertainment, or anything culturally significant takes, I'm not your person.
Well, it was a good one. And on to next year.
That's right.
We are excited to welcome Dr. Scott Jensen back to the podcast for the first time in about 2.5 years. So thank you for joining us again.
Thank you, Becky and Michael, for having me on. I appreciate it. It's always a good conversation.
We are going to kind of start with the big news of the week. So as many of our listeners, or probably all of them know, you were the 2022 endorsed gubernatorial candidate and came back, decided to run again for governor here in 2026. And, we know it was a crowded field on the Republican side. But this week, you decided to shift your statewide campaign. Walk us through that decision, that announcement, and where we stand today.
8 months ago, when my wife and I and our campaign team made the decision to run, it appeared to us fairly clearly that it was going to be a race between incumbent Governor Tim Walz and whoever the Republican nominee would be. In that situation, we felt strongly that with our wide name recognition and the strong support and fundraising we'd experienced in 2022, that would be the strongest candidate to win in November of 26. But things changed. 6 weeks ago, it was all about fraud and Tim Walz. Today, it's about ICE and Amy Klobuchar. I don't think that it's a surprise to anybody that whether you're talking sports or politics, sometimes one opponent matches up better with another opponent. Quite frankly, part of the reason I withdrew is because Senator Amy Klobuchar is a different kind of opponent than Tim Walz. And I think that, frankly, I think there are other candidates running for the Republican nomination that might well bring a different perspective and dimension to the November race against Amy Klobuchar than I could. And for that reason, I had to give serious thought to should I be stepping aside because we're literally only 4 months away from early voting starting and we need to start coalescing our efforts. And so that's the thought process. At the same time, I was being asked by quite a few people, would I consider running for a different statewide office? Frequently, I was asked to consider running for the US Senate, but that wasn't something that I wanted to do. And so as I started to combine those two thought processes, one, I'm not going to be the strongest candidate in November. And two, is there a different interest where I could serve Minnesota? That's really what came together that brought about the decision to run for state auditor. So many people have asked me, well, Dr. Jensen, you're a physician, not an accountant. But a lot of people don't realize that it's been more than 50 years since Minnesota had an accountant as their state auditor. I have had a wealth of experiences in my life that I think prepare me for this opportunity. I've been the chairperson of the audit committee for a $1 billion bank for more than a decade, looking at financial statements and P&Ls and classified assets for 2 or 3 decades. I've been on different bank boards. I've started businesses and created clinics, and I was the lead negotiator with the teachers when I was chairperson of the school board. And I think also when I was in the state Senate. I was the vice chair of Health and Human Services, and that's one of the largest line items in the Minnesota budget. So I think I have a wealth of experiences that allow me to do a good job as state auditor. But even more importantly, I think I understand the common sense of what it takes to be an auditor. And it's not complicated. It has to do with compliance with internal controls and standard operating procedures. It has to do with oversight. And I think the best way to provide oversight with a government entity is to be on the offense. Don't just be playing defense where you're reacting. I think it matters a lot that the state auditor mitigate the risk of unfunded mandates or underfunded mandates. And I don't think that has been done so much. Minnesotans don't realize that the state auditor is in charge of public pensions for teachers, for state employees. Also, with this Paid Family Medical Leave Act that has been passed, this is a major potential calamity for Minnesotans. A lot of folks don't realize that almost 400 full-time equivalent positions were created for the administration of this program. That's bigger than 98% of the private companies in Minnesota. And the state auditor has a role in terms of determining best practices and is the mission of that legislative initiative being met or not. And I think it's also important to recognize that as a physician, I spend my entire day asking questions of patients. Where does it hurt? How long does it hurt? What makes it better? What makes it worse? Are you having any bleeding with it? Do you have a fever? That kind of interrogating inquiry is what you need to do as an auditor. And I think you need to be able to advocate for people that are under advocated for. I think I talked with Julie Blaha the other day, and I do believe that Julie could have spent a little more time advocating for the underrepresented, those who are challenged, those who depend on personal care attendants. I haven't seen the auditor's office make certain that best practices are coming to play, particularly during these raucous political times where funding is being challenged by the federal government. There's a lot of folks out there who absolutely rely on a PCA, and some of those dollars are missing. And I think lastly, I think it takes a certain amount of courage to say the quiet thing out loud. Perhaps at times people would consider me foolish for not being more restricted in terms of what I comment on. But my basic nature is to say what I'm thinking and to say the quiet thing out loud, even if it does get me in trouble. And I know that Michael would never be accused of that, but I have been accused of that, and I get it. And lastly, I think when it comes to compliance and audits and accountability, I think everyday Minnesotans are saying we want to change and we'd like to have some balance at the state government level. So when you look at the 5 constitutional offices, governor, lieutenant governor, attorney general, secretary of state, and state auditor, I think a lot of folks would like to see a little balance there. And I think I could bring that to the table.
I love that. I'm curious, was this a tough decision for you, or is this something, like you said, as you looked at the field, as navigated through having, Klobuchar being the opponent versus Governor Walz, understanding your background, was it an easy, once you decided maybe not continuing on in governor, was it an easy thing to jump over here? And do you feel that same passion and fight for it that we've seen for you on the campaign trail over the last couple of years?
My passion, really, as a family doctor at the age of 71, I'm not looking for a stepping stone and I'm not looking for a new career. I've been chairman of church council, Rotaries, Lion Clubs, Chamber of Commerce in Waconia, Watertown, Wabasha. I enjoy public service. I enjoy solving problems. But to get to the heart of your question, was it an easy decision? No. And part of the reason was I felt that I would definitely be disappointing some folks by stepping down. And I think a lot of people felt that my strongest support was with everyday Minnesotans, the nearly 1.2 million people who voted for me in 2022, who allowed us to set fundraising records and things like that. So I felt bad about disappointing folks. But the easy part of the decision was I find politics offensive when so much of the emphasis is on trying to ridicule your opponent. The last damn thing I want to do is spend the next 8 months trying to attack Senator Amy Klobuchar. Whether or not you agree with all the decisions she's made, some of the strategies she's utilized, she has had a celebrated career as leading Minnesota in the U.S. Senate. And I appreciate that. Now, I think people can talk about her position on Obamacare and her position on Joe Biden's fitness for service and his southern border policies. That's fair game. But it was an easy decision, Becky, for me to be able to step away from that and say, hallelujah, I really don't want to be doing that.
No, and one thing I will say, when I saw the news come out, I've long said that the state auditor position is the one race where I think there was a real opportunity for Republicans to win statewide because of the fraud issue. And when I saw you got into that, my father was a CPA and a forensic accountant, and I don't. And we talked about politics and government when he was alive. We never ever discussed the state auditor's race and said that there needed to be a CPA there, or need to be an accountant there. I think that what you've articulated, the understanding of the role of the private sector versus the public sector, the role of state government, the inquisitive nature. One of the things I think that you've discussed before is kind of that intellectual curiosity. And I think that is something where I think you serving in that state auditor role, I think is going to would be very fascinating. I think for all of the experience that you have in government, I mean, you were a state senator, you were on the school board. I think you still have a good, solid foot in what I would call everyday real life. And so I think that it would be fascinating, particularly in light of to the degree at which there has been, I think, a narrative out there about that the state auditor could have done more related to some of the healthcare fraud that we've had in this state. And I think it really to me, it made a lot of sense. And I thought it was a smart move. I thought it was a very smart move. And I think it's going to be very fascinating to see, because I think your candidacy is going to get a lot of attention. And I think there are a lot of people who are going to think that this is a good fit.
Thank you, Michael. When I spoke with Julie Blaha the other day, I thought it was very gracious on her part when I announced she called. And so I called her back.
That's nice.
And we spent an hour on the phone. And
that's really, I don't mean to interrupt you. That's really nice. We should just stop for a second and just say, that's really nice. That's the type of stuff that just fills my heart with gratitude, that there's still, that she called you and you answered, or vice versa, however it happened. The fact that you guys did that, that's really nice.
Well, thank you. And I don't mean to break a confidence, but when I asked her why she wasn't running again, and Julie said, I served 2 terms. I think that we've shored things up. I think this is a good time for a transition to a new state auditor. And I thought that was just so refreshing. I thanked her for her service. I think that if someone were going to ask, what would they see different between Julie Blaha and myself? In the world of medicine, we frequently talk about best practices. And that's sort of a volatile phrase, because who gets to decide what the best practices is? Should you do the CAT scan or should you do the MRI? Does your decision-making depend upon if you own part of a CAT scan or if you own part of an MRI? Is there a conflict of interest? These are the things that we talk about in medicine. But the auditor has clear responsibility to utilize the review of best practices in the state of Minnesota. I would utilize that more. I would say, did we use best practices in terms of responding to the Office of the Legislative Auditor? Because they have been saying, not just for 5 years or 10 years, but they've been saying for 15 or 20 years that internal controls in Minnesota government are inadequate. So I would look for more best practice reviews from Scott Jensen. I think you'll see more focus on LGA inequities. I think if you look at what some cities get and what other cities get, there's a rationale for some cities to feel like they're getting the short end of the stick. I think that when it comes to advocating for people that might be getting the short end of the stick, also in terms of developmental challenges and needing PCAs, as I mentioned before, that's a big deal. I think in the world of healthcare, I think the auditor has a role to play in regards to, if we let a large system buy up a bunch of clinics, and then after 5 or 10 years of analysis, that large system says, okay, we now understand the business model here, so we're going to shut 6 clinics down. We're going to take these services away from this hospital and put them over here. I think the state auditor might have a role to say, hold it. What about healthcare access? How far is a pregnant woman having to drive in order to deliver their child? I think that these are things that I would like to do a little bit more of as state auditor.
Help educate me and our listeners a little bit on this, because what then would that require then you working with the legislature to enact some of those or pass some laws like that, or is that something that the auditor has the ability to do yourself?
The auditor has the ability to inquire and to investigate. And if there's any misconduct or malfeasance or nonfeasance, the state auditor has statutory right to go there. So I think oftentimes the establishment of misconduct or malfeasance relies on determining if nonfeasance, in other words, not acting. If you're not acting to preserve access to healthcare in a community of 5,000, I think the state auditor has the right to ask the question. But if the state auditor thinks that they can ride independently, like some cowboy in the wild, wild west, I think they're misguided. I would initiate right away. Every month, I would spend an hour with the Democratic caucus in the House, the Democratic caucus in the Senate, the Republican caucus in the House, and the Republican caucus in the Senate. I would want to meet every week with them and say, how can I help? Where are you at? Would you consider such and such initiative? I don't know if you know Jim Nobles, but Jim Nobles was in position when I was in the Senate. And my stars, what a man of integrity. He took the office of the legislative auditor and he gave the legislature solid advice. Shame on the legislature for not paying enough attention to what he had to say, particularly regarding standard operating procedures and internal controls. We have had crappy legislation passed out of the legislature only to leave the real nuts and bolts of a piece of legislation to the rule makers. And nobody knows who they are in terms of the public. So these are unelected people tasked sometimes unfairly with the role of trying to determine what was the legislature really trying to accomplish. I think we should be telling the legislature, be more thoughtful, maybe less volume, better bills. Let's quit with the 1,000-page omnibus bills on the last day of session. Let's do the job right. Let's have a conversation about term limits, because if we had term limits, maybe people would be less paranoid about the next election and more inclined to do the work that they're faced with.
I'm just nodding along and because I think this is all so great. I mean, I think the collaboration between the administration, regardless of the side of the aisle, with the different caucuses is something that we need from all of our constitutional officers. I think that is a great way to start. And I think your comments about leaving some of that stuff up to rule makers, I mean, we're about to go into another legislative session that I think there could be a decent part of the time needing to be spent on some of these fixes because things were not included or left out or need to be changed. And I think that that is something that I would also aspire and hope for and be optimistic that you and others can hopefully bring that back to the legislative process, be a little bit more thorough and thoughtful as we're working through it, because it does seem as though Minnesotans deserve to have folks who do the work and do it well.
Thank you, Becky. I think part of the reason people follow your podcast is they frequently catch the two of you, whether intentionally or inadvertently, making a comment that clearly is saying the quiet thing out loud. And I think we need more of that.
As you were describing, I was thinking about the next question I had. And the next question I was going to have was, how are you going to elevate the profile of the race? Because, you ran at the top of the ticket this time, and this is a down ballot race. But as you were talking, I was saying to myself, well, he's answering my question, because he's talking about things. And Becky and I were both nodding, because some of the things that you talk about are kind of, and I don't speak for Becky, but kind of near and dear to us, which is we like to see better cooperation and collaboration between Democrats and Republicans, and particularly when it comes to government oversight and the opportunity for the state. I think that the state auditor position represents a real opportunity to increase this, not necessarily from a government footprint standpoint, from a visibility standpoint. And that's what I think you're uniquely positioned to do, is to elevate the race. How do you plan to, aside from some of the policy ideas that you have, how do you plan on elevating the race? Because we're going to have an open U.S. Senate race this year. There was a governor's race that's going to be, but how do you fight through all that noise and get the attention that rightfully this office deserves?
I think there is confusion about the state auditor role. And I think that's why, even in the first few days of our campaign, one of the questions we've been asked most is, you're not an accountant. What business do you have running for state auditor? Again, it's been half a century since we've had an accountant. I think life experiences frequently are the thing that provide us an expertise, particularly in the world of business. But take the Paid Family Medical Leave Act. I think if you're in the trenches having to deal with the process of what the Paid Family Medical Leave Act will or won't do to your company, that gives you a leg up on someone who perhaps lives in a more academic world, or perhaps is a younger individual who hasn't had the breadth of life experiences. So how am I going to elevate the race? One of the best ways we can do it is try to help people understand the similarity between what I would do as a state auditor and what everyday Minnesotans do every week or every month in their home. They audit their checkbook. They don't wait till July to look at their January bank statement. They want to make certain that if there's a discrepancy, it's picked up quickly. We need to do the same thing in the state auditor's role. If we have a program or an initiative legislatively that was budgeted to spend $3 or $4 million a year, and less than 2 or 3 years later, it's over $100 million, what in the world happened? I think the more we make the case to everyday Minnesotans that the state auditor could be their sort of everyday person trying to translate what's going on, a lot of times we lose people in the weeds. And I think as a physician, I have an advantage. A lot of times I may have a patient that comes to me with a cancer diagnosis, and they've talked it over with the oncologist, the cancer specialist, and they'll ask me to translate. And so I'll say, well, what it means is you've got a tumor, it's spread into the lining, but it hasn't gone to the lymph nodes, it hasn't gone to any major organs. That's why we call it stage 2. And at stage 2, we think you have an 80% chance of being cured of this. And a cure for us is when you're disease-free for 5 years or more. That's the translation. I think we need to do the same thing with the state auditor position. Don't get lost in the weeds. Make certain that Minnesotans understand that when it comes to doing the budget, the big ticket items are education, healthcare, and oftentimes transportation. Those are 3 things that people want to know about. So let's tell people. I did a best practice review of the Met Council, and here's what I found. And my recommendation would be have the Met Council do the work that they're designed to do, but don't give them the capacity to tax. Because as soon as you give them that, they might have more power and authority than you want them to have. And then I would compare our Met Council to the similar Met Councils around the nation and explain the differences. When I sit on school board, first thing I did was I said, let's choose 5 school districts around the area that we think we're comparable to, so that when we're wondering what to do next, we would know, well, why don't we go look at Buffalo, Hutchinson, let's go look at Chaska, and we'll look at Glencoe because we're in Waconia. Do the same thing if you're on the board of directors for a golf course. What 5 golf courses are most like us? Same thing with the church. Find comparables so that you can translate what you're seeing to the everyday person. Because if you don't have followers, then you aren't a leader.
That's right. Just a quick point, a little on-air PR bump for you, which is that just remember, we have 5 constitutional offices, one of which is the Attorney General. You're not required to be a lawyer to be the Attorney General. So, as you're also not required to be an auditor to be the state auditor. And so just remember that.
Thank you, Michael. But I'm going to say right now, and you guys will have the scoop on this, Scott Jensen is saying categorically, without question, he will not run for Attorney General.
Great. That we just broke some news. Thank you for that always, Dr. Jensen. That's so nice of you. Thank you. Talk a little bit about the political landscape for Republicans right now in this state. It's a unique situation right now that Republicans in. And honestly, I think you're uniquely qualified to navigate it. But I wanted to give you an opportunity to talk about how you see some of the areas where there's opportunities for Republicans to message to, and areas where they need to do some work coming into the 2026 elections?
One of the most important lessons that I learned at the supper table growing up in Sleepy Eye, Minnesota, was from my dad, who was a lawyer and he was a legislator for a while as well, and he ended up being a judge. But we oftentimes would talk about topics at the dinner table, and Dad would challenge us. He would put an issue on the table. Maybe he'd say, school vouchers. And then he'd say, Scott, why should we have them? And then he might ask my older brother, Steve, why should we not have them? And I think it's more than an academic exercise. What it really is it's a little bit like that Steve Covey rule back in the, I think, early 1980s. Seek first to understand, then be understood. And I think that's what we need to do more politically. I think Republicans at times suffer from a little bit of righteousness. They're quite certain that they have the correct position, particularly on personal issues, ethical issues, moral issues. But for every Republican that feels strongly about it, there's a Democrat who feels strongly about it also and sees the issue differently. I think we need to do a better job of listening. I think we have to ask ourselves the question, why am I a Republican? Is it because I have this and this position on these three social issues? Or is it broader than that? Does it have to do with the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution? Does it have to do that with the fact that me becoming sort of an adult participant in the political world during the Reagan years? I remember Ronald Reagan. I always thought there's a guy who really elevates faith and family and really stands for freedom, loves the founding fathers' works, stands strong for life, stands strong for limited government, stands strong for lower taxes, hates communism, loves celebrating excellence wherever you see it, always stands for individual liberties because he knows that if individual liberties are lost, frequently it's very difficult to get them back. He always told us to try to be a better version of ourselves tomorrow, and that hopefully today we were better than yesterday. To me, that was the man who inspired me. It wasn't that he told me how to determine what my moral compass would look like. I was in my 20s and 30s, and I was just as so many people are. I wanted to make my own personal decisions. I was out from underneath the heavy influence of my folks, and so I got to decide. Was I going to use tobacco or not? Was alcohol something that was okay for me or not? Was I going to dabble in marijuana or not? These are the decisions I got to make. And I think that Republicans could do a better job, because if we don't, if we think that the world has changed enough that we can pontificate on the moral issues and win in November statewide, I think we're sticking our head in the sand.
Absolutely spot on. Pitch perfect. Becky.
I echo those sentiments. I think it is very refreshing to hear, because this is something that Michael and I talk a lot about. I don't think that we fit into maybe what the current majority makeup of the Republican Party might look like at this time, but we do both consider ourselves still Republicans, and I think that it's good to remember, and it's great to hear that you and hopefully other Republicans understand that there is such a wide spectrum of folks who consider themselves Republicans and who want to vote for Republican candidates and who want to support our policies and ways of thinking and being. So I appreciate you looking at that and being so willing to listen. I think it is something we don't necessarily hear a lot of, or people say they want to listen, but we don't see that in actuality. And I kind of want to ask this because I think that we've seen that from you over the last couple of years, from throughout your 2022 run for governor, immediately following when you joined us for a couple of interviews in 2023. Talk to us a little bit about some of those lessons you learned from that race and that loss to deciding to run for governor again, and what you are hearing when you've been meeting with delegates and meeting with constituents around the state.
Let me be clear. I don't think that there's anything quite like being in the heat of battle to learn from. I think most people at the end of their lives would acknowledge that It was the hard challenges where we grew the most. I've said it before. If you win a golf tournament, you sort of have a warm afterglow for a couple minutes and maybe have a celebratory beer, and then you get on with your life. If you lose a golf tournament that you should have won, you agonize over it. You ask yourself, why in the world did I hit that golf shot? Why didn't I play it safe? 2022 taught me so much. I have had a nice life. I ran 3 times for the school board. I won every time. I was chairman of the school board. I ran for the Senate in 2016. I won with more votes than any other Republican senator. I didn't expect that to happen. But in 2022, boy, did I learn a lesson about the nuance that gets involved with issues. I made mistakes. I remember making a comment at a rally on something that I couldn't corroborate. And I should never have made that comment. If you're not willing to back it up, don't say it. That's the lesson I learned. That's on me. So I think I've had the chance to learn that, yeah, sometimes integrity means learning more about an issue, understanding different dimensions of the issue, and changing your mind. Here's an example, and I'm sure that this is not prudent for me to bring it up, but I will. Let's talk about President Trump's immigration policy. I think 18 months ago, there were an awful lot of Americans who voted for President Trump because they heard loud and clear that he was going to provide a secure southern border and get rid of bad actors. That's what I think a lot of people heard. I think that there wasn't maybe too much time spent on what will he do with the dreamers? What will he do with the everyday undocumented illegal immigrants who didn't follow the rules, but who are embedded into our society? Their kids go to school. The adults are working, paying taxes, contributing to the Little League and Girl Scouts and Boy Scouts. I think we maybe had an underlying hope that solutions would come forth. Okay, that was 18 months ago. Now let's fast forward to today. I think the great majority of Minnesotans have tremendous concern about the tactics that ICE has used. Have we turned our back on the basic 2 initiatives, secure a southern border, get rid of the bad actors? No, but we want more because President Trump has delivered a strong southern secure border. He has negated this slow slide towards globalism. And I think a lot of people appreciate that. But we want more now. We want solutions for those good undocumented immigrants who have something to contribute and consider themselves Americans, but for whatever reason didn't go through the process of spending 5 or 10 years of their life to become a citizen and spend $5,000 to $10,000 to become a citizen and potentially put themselves on the radar screen while they did that. They simply had their job, kept their nose clean, stayed under the radar screen, and contributed. I don't want them being plucked off the streets when their 2 kids are waiting at home for them to come home and serve dinner. I think this is the nuance that Minnesotans and Americans are facing. This isn't about saying someone is bad and someone is good. This isn't about saying that the president is or isn't doing his job. I think this is what happens when we, in the moment, get a chance as humans to appreciate a depth and a perspective that we maybe hadn't fully considered before. That's not flip-flopping. That's integrity.
I thank you for saying that.
Absolutely.
We've talked a lot about this issue, and I think on our last episode or 2 weeks ago, I had a what I like to call rant, and Michael just calls me talking, but went into how I am so frustrated with Republicans for not being able to look at this objectively and say we want, exactly what you just said, and be able to say it doesn't mean you're not supporting the president. It doesn't mean you're going against us. It means you've looked at the situation unfolding in front of us in our state, in our communities, in hearing the stories of, I had shared previously of, my friends whose kids go to a Spanish immersion school and having to do carpools with other children and teachers because they are afraid to commute themselves, either take public transportation or just drive. these real folks, like you said, who want to work, who want to send their kids to school, whose lives are being impacted, who are, our local economies and are being impacted. And we're just seeing these real effects. And it doesn't seem like a step too far for Republicans to be able to look at this compassionately and say what is right and wrong, and maybe where we have gone too far, even when we want to support the overall mission of getting bad actors out and making our country more secure. So I appreciate that, because especially because it's not necessarily anything that falls under the role of a state auditor. I think, being willing to make statements and take stances of things that are going to be asked about, that just being a candidate for anything are things that people care about and are going to ask about. And I think you clearly have put a lot of thought and time into how you want to frame your stance on that, and what you really think. So thank you for that.
Becky, thank you.
I just want to follow up on that and just say, I have a lot of frustrations with the Republican Party right now. And I try not to interject that into this interview. But I certainly hope that Republicans in this state are willing to allow for that level of thoughtfulness that Dr. Jensen, you've just provided on this important issue. Every piece, independent of how you felt in your core, how you felt in your heart and in your mind, every bit of polling shows that Minnesotans are recoiling to what has been going on in this state. And again, just because polling shows, that doesn't mean politicians should shift their core beliefs. But the truth of the matter is that it is the political environment right now is, I think, very much open to people who want to be thoughtful about what Minnesota has experienced the last couple months. And someone coming in and saying, hey, we want to get the worst of the worst out of here. I don't see signs for people saying, hey, let's keep the rapists and the murderers here. But on an understanding that from a government operation standpoint and from a bureaucracy standpoint, Republicans there is an opportunity here for that to come in here and say, this could have been done different. And that doesn't mean you disagree with the president. That doesn't mean you're not a Republican. I just truly hope that Republicans embrace that message, because I think what you've articulated, Dr. Jensen, is where more than 50 to 60% of Minnesotans, probably getting close to 70% of Minnesotans are, which is, we want the worst of the worst gone, but this was not handled in the best way. We want there to be a secure border, but what we've seen, this experiment that's played out in Minnesota, has not been handled well. And can we do it better, more thoughtfully, and in a more caring, deliberative way in the future? That's where I think the sweet spot is in this election. And I hope to see more Republicans like you dominating that space, because I've seen Democrat after Democrat occupying that compassionate kind of centrist position on where we should be looking at from a government perspective and from reforms. And I just get frustrated that your brand of conservatism, which I think is conservative, which I think is Ronald Reagan, rock rib, growing up as I did, the type of republicanism that I identify with, I just hope that there's a place for that today. And I hope you get rewarded for being thoughtful.
Thank you. Michael, you and I are, and I know I'm older than you, so I do not mean to be disparaging your youthfulness, but you and I are old enough to remember, in part, why has this issue seemingly turned? And I think some of it has to do with 25 years ago when 9/11 happened. There was a tremendous concern that there were Al Qaeda cells in America. There was a lot of discussion about how difficult it was to ferret out cells of people that had, if you will, intentions of doing harm to America. So there was that piece. 25 years later, we see the southern border having become, for a period of time, a sieve.
Yep.
And so there was a strong notion on the part of many people that we saw what happened with 9/11. We have to be smarter. We have to have a strong southern border. So those polarizations that occurred are understandable. But here we are. And like you said, Michael, literally over a 60-day period of time, Minnesotans and Americans across the nation have had to re-examine, okay, hold it, what were we asking for? And I think that's why I'm willing to articulate strong southern border, get rid of the worst of the worst. But beyond that, let's solve problems. I think it's so frustrating that people don't realize that if magically ICE could remove every illegal immigrant in Minnesota in the snap of a finger, our economy would be crushed. Our supply chains would be severely interrupted. People would die, whether you're talking about access to pharmaceuticals or food or emergency health care. People have got to have a broader, eyes wide open kind of approach here. There are a lot of folks out there that are illegal immigrants, good people, and they do jobs that are indispensable frequently that nobody else wants.
You're absolutely right. And one of the things that Becky and I discussed as during the last couple of years is Trump obviously threw the marker down about what he was going to do from an immigration standpoint, but we talked about how that was unrealistic and how that implementation of it was going to be unrealistic. And I think you've touched on a really good point, Becky. I didn't want to cut you off.
No, I just again continue this to appreciate your sentiment and how you are framing this. I'm curious of the response from folks is especially when we talk about the delegates and some of the activists that might lean a little bit further right, might really have their home firmly in the mega camp and don't want anything that potentially could even come off as going against the president. Do you get receptions to this? Do people understand where you're coming from and why you believe and think the way you do on this?
Some do, but some don't. I tell people, listen, running for state auditor, I am trying to balance the books, and I'm not interested in trying to audit the bedroom. The social issues can be parked to the side. I'm an auditor. I don't pass laws. I don't enforce laws. I monitor compliance with the laws, internal controls, best practices. And I think that there's a fair amount of people that feel like maybe I am not where they're at on the social issues, but they're willing to say, you know what, Doc, you're not really going to have that much influence on that. I think that in the same way that you were a strong voice during the years of COVID and you said the quiet thing out loud, you'll do that again here. And that would be well serving of Minnesotans. And I hope that people realize that.
Great. I love that. So we do have, there are other Republicans in the race. How do you hope to kind of, not only do you have to break through the noise of the other statewide campaigns, both houses, both chambers are up for election this time around. How are you going to navigate the endorsement primary within the state auditor's campaign as well?
Well, we're definitely ambitiously seeking the endorsement, but I've been clear. I'm going to run as long as I believe I'm the best candidate to win in November. Hard stop.
Great.
But I'll say this. I think in terms of our campaign, we're entirely focused on what we want to tell everyday Minnesotans we're going to do. We're going to take the state auditor position. We're going to work within the constitutional and statutory limits of that job. We may well go to the legislature and say, would you be willing to broaden certain capabilities of the state auditor's office? A specific example might be, should the state auditor's office have more to do with determining eligibility of healthcare providers? This is an area where who's credentialed to provide healthcare services? Who's credentialed to provide certification for 10 weeks off regarding the Paid Family Medical Leave Act? It may well be a good fit for the state auditor to be involved with eligibility requirements and some of those things. And I think we can work with the legislature, especially if I go to the legislature and say, listen, I am not interested in going on some kind of power trip. I want to work with you. I want to help heal Minnesota. There's no Democrat that has all the right answers, and there's no Republican that has all the right answers. And I think envisioning what we could be tomorrow is a part of what people expect from their public servants.
Bravo. I mean, that is That is as well said and as apple pie as it gets. By the way, I don't think Becky is an apple pie person. I think she's more of a pumpkin person.
What?
But
Pie?
by the way, Dr. Jensen, I just wanted to note you made a couple of references to President Reagan. I learned in a recent episode that Becky was not born until the second part of his second term. And so you speaking about Reagan is like someone talking to us about George Washington to her. So that's what it's like. She's just there. What's different about, give us your enthusiasm, because you're running for office. And one of the things that Becky and I always want to do is the people we have on our podcast are people that we want to elevate. We want to elevate their voice. They're people that we think deserve to be elevated and people that we want people to get excited about. What's the difference this time between the last time? I mean, how are you going to stay energized and keep it going? But this time, because it's a different race. But as I asked that question, I got to tell you something. I've been really impressed by your answers. And I think you're going to be able to get that energy going. But describe to our listeners maybe the difference in the dynamics of the race and how you have to fine tune things a little different.
I remember Ben Carson, when he ran for president, he had sort of a rapid upswing. Then he had sort of a trough and then another upswing. And he was interviewed and asked about that. And he said that he felt that maybe he'd been overmanaged in terms of messaging. I think for our campaign and for me personally, in 2022, one of the blessings and gifts, without question, was the incredible, ferocious energy that was there. Town hall meetings turned into rallies. Yep. Fundraising efforts didn't turn up $20,000 of fundraising. It turned up $40,000 in a given night. There was so much energy. So when we announced last summer, I had to go through a real transition to see, holy cow, this is pretty sleepy. People say they're really motivated, this, that, and the other thing, but they're not engaging. So I think there was a little bit of an expectation for up here that actually was here. And I think now even over the last week or two, I felt a certain freedom to engage more openly with the everyday Minnesotan and say, okay, I get it. We're not living in a time of COVID. The George Floyd riots are a long ways away. I get that. There's a wish for peace and getting along. But here we are. We had fraud and we had ICE and we've got lots of challenges. And President Trump is never boring. There's always at least 10 things on the radar screen. But I think I feel such a freedom to talk honestly and candidly. And maybe that's because I've been able to make peace with the fact that in 2022, I made mistakes. Some of them were unforced errors. Shame on me. You know what? I'm human. As a politician, you could probably call me relatively naive. I learned a lot. And I'm here to try to speak for the everyday Minnesotan. And I'm not going to get my undies in a bundle. I think I'm going to be more guarded, more constrained. If I can't corroborate something, I'm not talking about it. And it feels good. So I sort of feel like the energy level in our campaign team has picked up in the last few days. And Michael, it feels good. Thank you.
Good.
I would say that feels very reflected in your candor and your, and in this interview itself. So it energizes me. It makes me excited. I do want to end with just bringing it back to fraud once more before we go. I know that there are some dues, some authority that the state auditor has and some that they do not, as it relates to the fraud. And we know that this is going to be something that, despite not being at the forefront of our minds right now, is going to be something that is a big issue and hopefully something that Republicans up and down the ticket are reminding voters of as we head to the ballot, get closer toward November and head towards the polls in a few months here. Talk to us a little bit about how you're going to talk about that and how the state auditor, what role plays, and also, do you hope that role to potentially change to do a little bit more with fraud and overseeing and oversight of what's going on?
Well, I think people need to understand clearly that the focus of the state auditor's position is cities, counties, and school districts. And I think we're seeing fraud on a huge scale in Minnesota. What's happened, though, is other states have now done some digging, and they're finding also that they have been subjects of fraud. I think the same thing is going to happen with cities and counties. As we go through the budgetary process, they're going to see some discrepancies. They're going to see upswings in certain areas, certain line items on their budget. And they're going to start asking questions. Is something going wrong here? That's exactly what they should be asking. I think the state auditor's role, if we could create a platform, maybe using artificial intelligence, because that can really streamline things and keep costs down. But if we could create a platform where the 87 counties can intersect with one another, what are you learning? What did you find? How did you detect this? What digging did it take? Because I don't think there's any question we are going to find fraud. It's not going to be the billions of dollars, of course, but we're going to find fraud of a significant impact in cities, counties, and school districts. And so I think that, as is the case with so many things, top down is perhaps the natural way of government. But when something goes bottom up, frequently the results and the changes are more lasting. If you start bottom up, it means often that it was common sense that drove it. If it's top down, frequently it's people that are more focused on power and control and being the elites. We've done better in Minnesota when the everyday person is driving the show. If you look at Democratic Governor Rudy Perpich in the 1980s, whether you're Republican or Democrat, many people would be able to articulate that there were two major changes that happened in public education under Governor Perpich's watch. One, open enrollment. That meant that families had mobility and latitude, and parents had the ability to help get their kids plugged into where they would succeed. Huge open enrollment. Second, post-secondary enrollment option. Rather than be board silly your junior and senior year, you could conceivably go to a junior college, another college, a state university, and you could literally get a jump start. Those are two things that I think are 90-10 issues. Most people would say these were strong advances on behalf of parents, kids, and families. At the time, they were not. But these things bubbled up from the everyday person. These things didn't come from power brokers who thought that somehow these two changes would increase their power. So I'm a big believer in let's have some stuff come from the bottom up, and let's have an everyday grassroots person speaking for them. And if you're going to speak for them, you got to have the guts to take some hits. Otherwise, the everyday person just gets squashed.
Dr. Jensen, you have been just an absolutely refreshing guest that Becky and I desperately needed. I want to just give a brief story before we close out to our listeners. I mentioned this before in our podcast, but I want to say this again on the air. Dr. Jensen, you went to my daughter's class. You spoke to their class. You made such a good impression on that entire class by answering their questions, being engaged. And I just wanted to once again compliment you. I know we spoke and I said this on air, but I wanted to do it again just because that dialogue that you had with the entire class, your willingness to do that, your willingness to come on this podcast, and just the enthusiasm you have for this great thing we call democracy is very, very infectious. And we need more of that in life. And you've really had an impact on a lot of my daughters and many people in her class and their class and people all across the state. And I just want you to know, you always got a place to come on this podcast and talk about your campaign, talk about what's going on. And you'll always have a spot here. I just wanted to say thank you just for running again and just having that truly infectious kind of love and admiration for democracy and trying to just make life better for all of us. And I just really appreciate that. I just wanted to say that.
Thank you, Michael. That's kind of you. I appreciate it. I do.
Thank you so much, and good luck with everything.
Thanks. Have a great day.
You too.
Becky, we just did an interview with Dr. Scott Jensen, who is now running for state auditor, changing from running from governor. Your take on the interview?
It was fun. It was our first guest of 2026, aside from panelists, but like first interview guest. And it was nice. It was refreshing. It's a lot of what we've been hoping for. I was surprised and a little taken aback when he started venturing into commenting on ICE and immigration because I didn't know where it was going to go. But it was really nice to hear some pragmatic, thoughtful approach to things and articulating how we can look at where we are at one point in time, and it doesn't necessarily change our values and our policies and who we support for president. And I just thought it was really nice. And you can tell he is excited. You can tell that he has a passion for this kind of role as state auditor. I love the grassroots up, the bottom up approach is something I think fundamental to what a lot of Republicans believe government should look like. And really looking at this in a way that he clearly wants to serve and not just looking for, making a name for himself, which he already has great statewide name ID.
Yeah, I was very much impressed by the interview, and I have been impressed. This is the third time we've had the opportunity to speak with Dr. Jensen, and I have been impressed each time. And it seemed to me that he was at ease, and I think that this seems to be just a better fit for him this cycle. And I generally don't like to have candidates force them into handicapping and horse racing the race and talk about, other dynamics of it. But I do think, and I think it's something that we've talked about, the arrival of Klobuchar into the race being the 800-pound gorilla and being as strong as she is. I think that this is a better fit for him. And I think that's where it's, and when he was going through and discussing how he was going to look at the race, I'm like, yeah, this makes sense. Like this, I could see that. And I know there's other candidates running, but I just was very much invigorated by his enthusiasm as someone running for office. And it just goes to these candidate interviews, which we're going to do more of. It's really what I think, we always want to acknowledge what's going on out in society and where things are at and, do episodes that are relevant. But it was nice to kind of touch the grass again with a candidate who's out there. And as I said, welcome back to any time. And I look forward to having him back on the podcast.
And man, it's an election year. I'm excited, and it was energizing. It was, yes, it
Yeah.
was. I enjoyed smiling and nodding rather than some of the bleak, tragic episodes that we've had so far in the last couple of weeks. We are going to shift our attention before we get into some breaking updates on Operation New Surge or Operation Metro Surge. We're going to discuss the recent Star Tribune, NBC, Decision Desk, Care 11, a poll powered by SurveyMonkey in Minnesota. This was conducted January 27th through February 6th with about 1,200 Minnesotans were polled. Star Tribune calls it says that it shows Minnesotans and people across the country widely disapproving of President Trump's immigration crackdown in the state, which we've also seen nationwide in other polls. Star Tribune calls it a, quote, shift that's turned his deportation campaign from a political strength into a potential liability ahead of midterm elections, which we have been talking a lot about. So going down in through a couple of the numbers here, do you approve or disapprove of how U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, known as ICE, is handling its job? Not overly surprising here. Strongly approve is 23%, somewhat approve 14%, somewhat disapprove 7%, and somewhat or strongly disapprove is 57%. So that's 37 to 64% approve to disapprove. No surprising, most who identify themselves as Republican are on the side of supporting how ICE is handling their jobs. Is a break of about 15% that disapprove, which shows us what we kind of discussed, that Trump's voter base is generally sticking with him there. When we look at the tactics that ICE is using, 66% have said gone too far, 10% not far enough, and 23% about right. One thing that I think is a pretty significant drop is Trump's approval is at 40%. Last summer was at 45%. That is a pretty quick, drastic drop, especially as we're now just, 7-8 months out from the midterm elections here, which already has historically is trouble for the party in power. So that is going to be. Do you remember seeing a drop that significant that quick?
No, the only one that I can remember was I remember George Herbert Walker Bush had an approval rating of 91% right after the first Gulf War. And then he, of course, lost re-election in 1992. Trump has always been low, as the phrase would be, the kind of cake is baked on him. But this is certainly a drop. I wanted to ask you a very interesting question about this because I'm curious, and this is kind of a podcasty type question that I have is you and I think the polling has shown that our position, our kind of collective position, is where most people are at. Do you think, as podcast hosts, that is good or bad?
That's a really good question. I think I would like to say good. I mean, I think that we are reflective of the general population. I mean, I guess maybe if people want us to, if we're looking to get clicks and say things more on on an extreme one way or another. But yeah, I guess I don't know. What is your thought on it?
My thought was that it was good because, and I was just curious because I think that this is a debate that, and you said a very interesting word, clicks. This is, we're just seeing a lot of tribalism that it continues to exist. And there's these polar extremes. And what I found so interesting is, as you and I have discussed this over the last couple months, we've taken some positions that have been somewhat ahead of the curve more on this point. We said there should be an joint investigation ahead of polling. And we've gone out and I think on our podcast, the degree which we're classified as Republicans, gone out and gone against a little bit of the grain. And polling has come back to show that where kind of our position is where most people are. And I wanted to note that, not to say that we're smarter or better, but I think that it shows that I think that our instinct, our kind of read of the land is good. Now, that doesn't mean we can't have polarizing, that doesn't mean necessarily we lead by polling. One of the great examples is voter ID. Voter ID is incredibly popular, but it gets bogged down. So is on some matters related to gun control, very high in the polls, but there's also that type of stuff. I just thought it was interesting because on this particular issue, I think that we have been, more than any of our episodes, been a little ahead of the curve on our analysis being to where average people are. That's different than necessarily election results because when we talk about elections, we're not trying to predict a game. Think of it kind of like, I would view this so much like our Pick'em League. And not to be disrespectful, but what's our objective in the Pick'em League? To try to pick the best team and to be smart at picking the games. That requires a bit of an analysis and understanding. And that's different than elections because when you're a Republican or you're a Democrat, you're going to vote that way generally, independent of what the opponent is, and the electorate just is that way. But I find it interesting that on a number of these issues, I found it that we have been collectively where I think the vast majority of Minnesotans and people are about what's going on. And I just wanted to ask you, as a, not to spring the question on you, but I was just curious and I think it's good because I think if we're trying to break things down and have an audience that is informed, that and we can relate to our audience. I think this polling data shows that on this particular issue, because we know if there was food polls, you would not have any support. But on this particular issue, I think we've been where 50 to 60, if not more percent of the people are. And I think that's interesting. I just wanted to note that.
No, I appreciate that. I also think it's kind of a place where I think we've been consuming so much of it, of what's been going on in our state. And I think there are the folks on the right and the folks on the left that the politics runs through them in every thought, action, whatever it might be. And then there's some of us who are political beings, but also can look at things objectively. And I think this is one of those situations where, for me, it hasn't been wearing the partisan hat and what does my party believe and all of that. It has been looking at what is unfolding in front of us, and I think our conversations have reflected that. One thing that I did want to chat about a little bit is, so one of the questions was, should most undocumented immigrants in the US be, the options are offered a chance to apply for legal status or deported to the countries they came from? The overall for the state is 67% say offered a chance to apply, 33% say deported. When we look at Minneapolis and St. Paul, that's at 84% offered a chance to stay, 16 deported, and the rest of the state is 59% apply and 41% deported. But the Twin Cities suburbs here, 71% say, or I'm sorry, 70% say offered a chance to apply for legal status, with just 30% saying deported to the countries they came from. I think this is something similar to how Dr. Scott Jensen related when we were talking about and hearing immigration and deporting, illegal immigrants and some of the stuff from President Trump. I don't think we've been, I mean, since Obama was in office, right? Of talking about dreamers and DACA and all of this. And I just think there was a little disconnect in maybe what people thought and felt. But I think it's really important, and I want to urge and plea Republican candidates to notice those numbers, because the suburbs are a place we always struggle. The suburbs are a place we've been talking about since we started this podcast 142 episodes ago. But this situation, if this continues to move forward towards election and be in people's minds, 70% of folks hoping, and again, it says most undocumented immigrants. I believe what they're intending and how people took it is removing the, violent criminal immigrants that are here. I think we need to look at that. And I think we need to remember that that is such a huge number. 70% of Twin City suburb Minnesotans in the Twin City suburbs believe that undocumented immigrants should be offered a chance to apply for legal status, not deported. Thoughts?
I think is incredibly, and I think once again, you've dialed down on aside from breaking down all of this polling data, I think you've gotten to the absolute key data point that people need to look at. And kudos to you for highlighting it, because it's going to be a larger discussion that we need to have. But yes, it is a concern. I live in the suburbs, so do you. And I think that's one thing. And then you absolutely correctly noted, one of the things that we talked about when we did this podcast is wanting to make sure we did more to talk about and elevating the voice of female candidates, female elected officials, and talking about how politicians and people talk to female voters, and then also on the suburbs. And this is a massive data point for the suburbs.
Thank you. Last thing that really kind of stuck out to me was just when asked about how confident are you that the federal authorities will conduct a fair and transparent investigation into the shootings of Renee Good and Alex Preddy. It was about 87% of Republicans said either very confident or somewhat confident, and about 73% of Democrats said not at all confident. If you include that with not too confident, that is 94% of Democrats say not confident, while 87% of Republicans say confident. Not surprising me that there is that split. The vast wide that split is surprising to me, and I think this is just a big testament to what we're seeing, and really showing why a need for a joint investigation to have that transparency, cohesion is really important there.
No, you're absolutely right. And again, you said it. And just to say it a little different, that's why when I'm always concerned about what happens when this is drawn down. We'll talk about that more, but how we heal as a state is, I think, by having a collaborative investigation, because I think by having it be collaborative, it will help the right and the left to the degree that which there is in this. And I think this poll has absolutely identified that. So once again, great job.
Moving from the poll, but still related, kind of going into a quick rapid fire, because we know that time is of the essence here, and there's a few topics that we want to hit on briefly, but break down a little bit further in a future episode. So starting with the update on Operation Metro Surge, breaking just this morning right before this podcast, White House border czar Tom Homan said that he proposed, and Trump concurred, that Operation Metro Surge will conclude. He said there will be a significant drawdown has already been underway this week and will continue to the next week. This is something that I think I applaud. I'm grateful to see. Hope that it means, what they're saying it means. Do you think that this is directly related to polling? Do you think that's how they got to Trump and got him convinced that this move was needed?
I would like to, I'm going to give you a complicated answer. First of all, I would like to think that the sheer inhumanity of how this was being implemented would have gotten to him and said we need to take a different approach and tactic. But I do think the data probably helped. And so the answer is yes, but with an asterisk.
Yeah, I think, we'll probably hear a little bit more about this. I know that we'll, next week we'll hopefully talk about it a little bit more when we see no more specifics of how quickly they're going to be leaving the state, what they, consider successes, what the overall numbers are out of Minnesota, what that looks like, and I'm sure there we'll see some more polling in the state and across the country as things move on. It will also be yet to be determined if they're going somewhere else, where they're going, and what's going to happen in other states. Because I don't believe that this, just because it's a drawdown in Minnesota, doesn't necessarily mean ICE is ceasing to conduct these activities elsewhere. But I think it is. I think that I think the president wants to preserve his hopefully at least Republican majority in one of the chambers. Doesn't want to have a complete lame duck presidency at the end of his term, and things are certainly looking like that is potentially going to be the case. So we'll be very interested in how Minnesota turns and what we're going to see around the country. Preya, our good friend Preya Samsundar, did write an op-ed recently that was posted in the Star Tribune over the weekend. She says, that's titled, "As a Republican, I support immigration enforcement, but Operation Metro Surge went too far." We might talk to her a little bit more, but can cover that a little bit more. I think just also we will want to continue to applaud her for taking a stance, for making her voice heard. I know you've talked to her and we lifted up some of her op-eds in the past of the long form writing that doesn't necessarily always happen anymore. And in particular from somebody who, like Preya, who has spent so much time working for these candidates in the party, and probably not an easy thing to kind of have that stance that's a little contrary to what some of the folks in the party believe and are thinking. But very proud of her for doing that, and want to talk about that a little bit more in the future.
Kudos to Preya, bravo. Always love the long form stuff, even when I disagree, and I have disagreed with her, but I think she was pitch perfect and look forward to having her on again.
Next little topic here, DC hearing. We have the Senate Homeland Security hearing is meeting in Washington, DC as we speak. A lot of Minnesotans are representing us. Among those testifying, we have U.S. Representative and Majority Whip Tom Emmer, Attorney General Keith Ellison, State Representative and Republican House Leader Harry Niska. We're going to have the heads of ICE, Border Protection, and U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. And on top of all of that, the Star Tribune reports that a 50-person Minnesota delegation, including State Senator Amy Quaid, Representative Brad Tapke, and Minnesotans who have been targeted by ICE, are also in Washington, D.C., rallying outside the Senate and the Capitol, urging lawmakers to get ICE out of Minnesota. Something that seems to be in the works. We know that there's going to be a lot more to report on after we hear and see all of these testimonies and what's going on. Any thoughts you would like to regale us with to start?
No, I think that I think there's going to be a number of hearings. I would not be surprised if there's more about what went right and what a lot went wrong with that poor grammar. And so I think that I don't think we're seeing, there may be operational drawdown in this state, but I think the level of oversight and questions and discussions, I think we're going to learn a lot more about what happened over the last couple months. And so there's more to come, but I think that this is going to continue to be a very, very significant discussion point.
And then last thing in our little rapid fire round here is next week, the Minnesota legislative session begins, starting back up on Tuesday, February 17th. And there's a lot of things to discuss on this that I think we can dedicate some more time in the future for. But a couple of things that are swirling around in my brain is, what does it look like now that there is, under lame duck walls, still a split legislature, but tensions are high? What, if anything, can get done? Will it get personal? We know during this ICE and immigration, we know we have immigrant legislators. We know we have legislators who represent big immigrant communities. We know things have been said on both sides of the aisle. Will it get personal? Will it get emotional? How are they going to work through this? And then, of course, it is the first session that will be going on without Speaker Melissa Hortman. And since her murder and the shootings of Senator John Hoffman, and so that is certainly going to play a role and going to be heavy in a lot of people's hearts and minds as they move through the session. So a lot of things going on. Look forward to discussing that a little bit further in the future.
My just quick take, putting on a partisan hat, I think the most significant thing is to watch about that first day is how they memorialize and honor Speaker Emeritus Hortman and her husband and the loss that occurred last summer. I'm also very interested in how the politics of the governor's race plays in. Speaker Demuth is running for governor, and very curious, Representative Chair Robbins is also running. I'm curious, and we can break this down on more episodes, is what does the politics of the governor's race, how does that change the composition of what's discussed, debated, the tone, and particularly, again, Governor Walz being a lame duck. I think he's going to be really, as I mentioned before, test the boundaries of what a lame duck governor can do. And I think he's going to be a real force.
Agreed. I look forward to discussing further.
Becky, thank you again for just an absolutely wonderful episode. Thank you to Dr. Scott Jensen. And thank you all for listening to this episode of The Breakdown with Brodkorb and Becky. Before you go, show us some love for your favorite podcast by leaving us a review on Apple Podcasts or on the platform where you listen. You can also follow us on our website and across all social media platforms at @BBBreakPod. The Breakdown with Brodkorb and Becky will be back next week. Thank you so much. Have a great weekend.
Bye-bye.